Hi, welcome all of you. Really, it's early morning here. There's a mist outside the window that suggests there won't be much wind this morning. So I think my sailing's off. But the result will be that we get a chance to sit and talk together for 45 minutes or so, and I hope you're patient because there's just a mass to put over in the time that we've got. I'm going to talk about three things really with you. I'm just going to talk through some history. It seems to me there are some things that we've always known about how technology and learning in the 21st century is going to be different to the last century. And then I'm going to reflect a little on it. Gosh, it would be churlish of me not to reflect on the new world we find ourselves in. I mean, the world economy apparently has gone to hell in a handcart. You know, we've got banks threatening meltdown, and even as I speak, the headlines are running here on a dawn morning, indicating that around the world, you know, the economy that we thought perhaps was stable and safe is rather less so than we expected. And finally, I'm going to say, what does all this mean for learning? You know, we're entering a new age of learning, and we need new schools, new universities, new strategies. Is this a revolution? Is it evolution? Is it a different place? So that's what we're going to cover, and we're going to do it in as gentle and conversational way as we can, because we have a chance later to discuss some of this stuff. So let's start. Let's start with that history. You can see I'm very old. These are lines, you know, the patina of centuries going on here. And I've been around this game for a huge amount of time. Started putting, wooden computers and the very earliest computers into schools to see if there was something magical about that illuminated screen that would captivate young minds. Of course there was. And all those years ago, the end of the 70s, the early 80s, the challenge for us really was, what could we make the technology do that was useful? We knew what we needed in learning. We just wanted to find some way of getting it to happen through these incredibly primitive screens with their blocky graphics, you know. And, do you remember those Pong games of we played on our computer screens? Well, you know, given the restraints, it wasn't very hard, to be honest, to find things that were compelling, seductive, and engaging. But now, the technology is a whole other world. Now I've got, you know, in my pocket here with my little iPhone, you know, I've got more computing power than the whole school had back in the 80s. You know, storage and connectivity and processing power and the little camera on the back and the ability to run web pages. My goodness. So the challenge for us now isn't what can we make the technology do. The challenge is, we're in a world where technology can do jolly well anything we want. In that world, what do we want? And what do we want turns out to be a very different thing, I think, to maybe what we were doing in the last century with those big factory schools and those economies of scale and wisdom being delivered and a curriculum being received and children reading, learning and inwardly digesting somebody else's information. So what were the signs? Where do we look back and see? Rather obviously, it seemed to me that we were moving into a different world. Well, in the 80s, I remember putting a network of children together. This is before the internet, where we had Prestel, sort of teletext service, and electronic mail, of course, which has been around for eons. And we joined all this together, and we allowed children and teachers to communicate from and to each other in a really rather compelling way. And did they enjoy it? Golly gosh, they did. Was it compelling? Yes. Were there things that they wanted to do? They wanted to be part of a community. They wanted to feel usness, and I'll return to usness over and over again in all this. They also enjoyed working at a distance, but not synchronously. It was the ability to swap ideas with people, to just post a provocation in those big chunky teletext pages with their clumsy graphics, and then to swap with each other the thoughts and reflections. And it turned out, even in the 80s, that those R words were very important: reflection, retraction, research, representation. And it was that distance between the now and the distance between the us that proved to be a very fertile space. Distributed asynchronous learning was pretty clearly working, even with all the restraints that were imposed upon it by technology and just by sheer cost. I mean, the sheer cost of building a gateway between an electronic mail service and a teletext service would have bought you a house. Back in those days, I'm sure they probably still will buy you a house, actually, the way prices are going. In the 90s, we built schools online. We joined up, not for the Department of Education, by the way, in Whitehall here in London, but for the Department of Trade and Industry. It was the trade and industry people who saw earliest, Ian Taylor, inspirational minister, that could see very early on that if we could get people talking or working together at a distance, this was going to have profound implications on the assumptions that we were making about the geographical location of industry, the need to get economies of scale by bringing people together in the same place, that proximity model that promised so much but actually offered in the end so little. And do you remember that in the 70s around the world, the factory model of production was disenfranchising individuals. You had people putting part A onto part B, in a very mechanical and mindless way, and with no idea what was happening on the other side of whatever it was that they were assembling. They didn't even know what it was that they were making. So, of course, they felt disengaged, and that disengagement, of course, turned itself into enemy and dissatisfaction and alienation and proper revolution. There were people standing at the gates saying, "Enough, absolutely enough." And around the world, we saw the mindless jobs in mindless organisations repelling the minds of our workers and families and friends. Well, now of course life's moved on, and we don't have mindless jobs anymore. We've got robots doing the mindless jobs, and we need smart children, as I've often said, that can build better robots. And the mindless jobs are being done by the robots, or maybe outsourced to a country that's temporarily grateful for that work. But even the countries that are temporarily grateful for that work can't wait to get into the jobs that are attractive and exciting and engaging and stimulating mentally. So it was pretty clear with schools online that people love that sense of usness. One of the most powerful things, and this was right at the beginning of the internet. People were struggling to connect with. It was Mosaic then. It was the beta version of what became Netscape, and it was the whole thing was about as stable as our royal family. Never quite knew where you were going to be at any moment, and even with all those constraints, it was clear that children wanted to know who's seen my stuff, who's looking at this page right now, who else is here at this moment. And that sense of usness turned out to be very, very powerful. They still like the ability to reflect at a distance. That what I came to realise, that in-betweeny space, which I'll come to later on, turned out to be very important. The space between here and now, and tomorrow, and the space between here physically and somewhere else. That turned out to be a very important learning space. But what was also powerful for that was the way that we just threw communities together. Following on from that, we built Learning in the New Millennium. I mean, within months of Schools Online, really. It's a huge project sponsored by Nortel. Nortel, of course, having invented fibre optic cable, were the perfect partners for all this. They wanted to know, what are we going to do with all this bandwidth? And with Learning in the New Millennium, which started in 93, and was due to run right through to 2003. In fact, it just ran past the millennium, before Nortel themselves got into some financial difficulties. But nevertheless, a 7-year longitudinal project where we took primary school, secondary school children, connected them up to scientists and engineers in Nortel's labs, average age 28, way younger than me. And they all had a PhD, by the way. And then we sort of stood back to see what was going to happen. And of course, what happened was that the primary school kids were dying to find out what the secondary school kids were doing and to learn their learning. And they were all together dying to find out what the scientists and engineers were doing playfully in their research labs. And of course, the primary school kids wanted to be able to do what the scientists and engineers were doing in their research labs, and they propelled themselves forward at the most extraordinary pace. I remember having to go in to visit one of the schools with the team because the school was saying after 5 years they were saying we want to call a halt to this project and we stop right here, because it's not fair that we're doing this project with the smartest children in the school. And well, we had to agree, but we had to also remind them that they weren't the smartest children when we started. They'd picked them on a blind test. They were just picked at random. And over the 5 years, there was something about being connected to others and with the intellectual stimulation of proper cerebral thought going on at the far end of all this that was absolutely electrifying. The children had become led forward by all that to become extraordinarily smart. Later, Nortel employed many of them directly and sponsored them through university. They thought, wow, this bunch are just fabulous. You know, we don't want to let one slip through our fingers. Of course, the irony being that the entire school population potentially was that fabulous, and we were somehow letting them all slip through our fingers because we had a curriculum that simply wasn't ambitious enough. You know, and one of the fascinating things about this was that Nortel itself rediscovered learning. The scientists and engineers were working with the children, were passionate about learning history, were passionate to see what the children were learning in classes, because many of them are specialised pretty narrow, pretty quick. And they were saying, oh, you know, gosh, I wish I'd done a little more history. This working from original sources, gosh, it's like detective story. It's just wonderful. And it became, you know, a conduit of communication. The children were not just taking out, but putting back into. One of the things we did towards the end of the project, we ran as part of the big Tomorrow's World live show in London, and we put up emails from the children and the scientists and the teachers on the project. The teachers were essentially, none of this would have happened without teachers. They were there just to ask the little provocations that made learning happen. If you just throw a bunch of kids together with a bunch of adults, you don't necessarily get anything other than conversation. But teachers are learning professionals, and they were the catalysts that made all this happen. They didn't have to provide the learning; they had to provoke it and be catalytic in making it begin. You know, they'd ask that naive little question, seemingly, that they knew would lead to a better understanding. And of course, the teachers too were learning from the scientists and engineers and from the children. And when we put all these emails up and said, do you know, can you tell who's who? People looked at them and said, no, we can't. We actually can't tell the primary school children from the scientists and engineers. You would have thought maybe spelling was a clue, but actually the children's spelling was a little better because they took care with their spelling, where the scientists couldn't wait to tap stuff in. They were so excited. Their spelling and grammar was all over the place, you know, barely an apostrophe between them. And then that sense of usness was reconfirmed for us with Tesco Schoolnet 2000, coming up to the millennium. Became the biggest internet learning project in the world. We were in the Guinness Book of Records. I mean, rather disappointingly, nobody came around with a tanker full of Guinness. You know, we were all kind of ready with our glasses, but no such luck. There's a certificate, and Intuitive Media, the technology partners in all this, I think have still got that for sure framed on the wall of the business. What we learned from Tesco Schoolnet 2000 was the magnitude of this. We put a computer lab into every Tesco superstore in the country, and we encouraged the local children. We said, go out, and here's your task for this month. Go out, for example, and find the earliest recollection of the oldest person where you live. I've often told how a group of children arrived on their bicycles to some old chap's house in Hove, and they said to him, "What's your earliest memory?" And he said, he said, I used to have a bicycle. I used to ride my bike all over here, and I used to ride it down that hill outside the window, And I was a bit of a naughty boy. I used to ride too fast, and I fell off one day, and I went under a bus, and the children, And then he went further, and he said, I was so scared because I nearly went under the hooves. Suddenly realised this was a horse-drawn bus that he'd gone under, And we had children interviewing celebrities. Gosh, I remember they came back from interviewing Elizabeth Hurley, who was very much in the news. That as she is now. Remember that frock all held together with safety pins? Was that then? It must have been around about that time, I think. They interviewed her, and she gave them the most candid interview about her school days. School days where she enjoyed games of kiss chase in the playground for sure. And where she got drunk at a party and fell off the bar and broke her arm. Just a whole mass of fascinating insights that she'd never have given to a journalist. And really interestingly, the journalists never thought to go to the site to get the insights from the children as they interviewed Kevin Keegan and Gary Lineker and pop stars of the day too. The journalists thought, how can it be worth looking at children's work? Because they're children, we're the journalists. Of course now, we're in a world where everybody is a journalist, everybody's a reporter, everybody with a camera like this, is able to sit down and do a broadcast and if they've got something to say it. But in those days, the idea that somebody else might do the job of interviewing celebrities and find out something useful was they just couldn't countenance it. Remember the children going to talk to David Blunkett, the most wonderful education minister, who just really did get the power of all this and understood the way that it could make a contribution to inclusion, to social equity, to the democracy of learning. But even he, with all those insights, when a little girl came up to him and said, "Minister, I'd like to talk to you about your earliest recollections," and one of her standard questions was, "Did you have a nickname when you were at school?" And David said, "Well, I did, but I'm not going to tell you in front of these journalists. Let's go over here and have a private conversation." Of course, she was doing a web page, so she had literally millions of children reading her page with her revelation about David's secret, which I won't share with you now. You should have had a look at the site, and it's still up. If you've got the nous to find it, go and have a look, and you'll see what it was called. But what we learned from Tesco Schoolnet was that usness extends to a sense of audience. The children's work was shown in the Dome, in that grand Millennium Dome, which I had a huge amount of fun being involved with. Some other time for the memoirs for sure. Some of the recollections of the excitement and indeed chaos that was putting that dome together and the cost. But one of the battles we fought was to have children able to go into the dome and put their work up on a screen and show it in the context of that enormous dome. And we knew that they were going to want to show off their stuff. We knew that they were going to want to celebrate it. And there was considerable argument about whether that was appropriate or not. And I remember sitting there on the first day it opened with my notebook, because I'm a great people watcher. I'm a bit sad like that, really. I just watch people and watch what they do and how they behave. It's so important if you're going to understand this 21st century. And there we were right at the beginning of the new millennium. And children were coming into the dome, dragging their aunties and grandmothers and uncles and stepdads and goodness knows what else with them, and saying, "Look, come and look at my work. Here's my work in the dome. I'm in the dome. I'm here." And they'd seen their work. The parents had all seen their work. There was something about seeing it in the context of that fabulous building. It was a most extraordinary structure that was exciting for them and that set their learning minds alive. So audience matters. That sense of usness, it turns out to be pretty complex. There's what I like to call me, we, and see. There's that me, my stuff. I'm proud of it. I just like looking at things I've done, as children mostly do. Just rummaging through, but some of that's pretty private. It's when you're having a bit of a go at romantic poetry, you really don't want anybody else to read it because you feel maybe a little nervous about all that. I certainly did. And then later there's that sense of we. So the me bit is about privacy, having a place to put stuff, having security, having a place to, maybe if I try it that way, perhaps if I put that over here, a place to take risks with your own learning. And then the we, of course, is when you start working with the intimacy of your immediate community, your classmates, people doing project work with you, your family and friends. And Facebook, I think, has been very strong in the way that it stresses the we bit. But then, of course, there's the see bit. There's the showing your stuff to everybody. And when it's ready, having the world watch it. And I remember back in those schools online days, those very early days, children watching the page count at the bottom, just how many people have looked at my stuff. They were past the me bit, they'd taken enough risks with their learning, they'd shared it with their friends and got some feedback, some mentorship, some good advice, and now they were ready to put it out in the world. And of course that sense of putting it out in the world, as we saw with Tesco Schoolnet 2000, in the dome, what better stage for your work, was hugely motivating. So me, we, see turns out to be huge insight. So here we were rolling through the early 90s really, and then into the middle and the end of the 90s, with an absolute certainty that community was a powerful word, that mutuality was extraordinarily strong, that usness was something to signal and signify. We needed cues and clues for membership and belonging, and those things turned out to be incredibly potent. Well, of course, it's hard to remember now, but back in those days, the fools in the sort of .com era were rushing around preaching, chanting their mantra that content was king, that somehow if you had stuff, people would come to your website, and the few people who didn't have stuff would try and we should build a portal. We have no purpose for existing, but people will come to us on their way to other people's stuff. Let's have a local authority portal, let's have a national portal, let's have a television channel portal. Of course, it's not absolutely about stuff. We're in a world where knowledge is a free good. I mean, gosh, it's best part of 5,000 images a minute are added to Flickr. When I used to teach, a pal of mine teaching geography had one of those Kodak carousels, you'll remember them, with all the 35mm slides in. He would show his geographical features to the kids every year. Here's a hanging valley, here's a meander, When he got to Roche Moutonnet, that sort of outcrop of rock that, like Edinburgh Castle is sitting on top of, he'd lost the slide, so there was literally a gap in the carousel, and he just described the Roche Moutonnet and then move on. So talking to some geographers a year or so back, I went to Flickr and just searched for Roche Moutonnet, and of course there are hundreds of really good quality images of Roche Moutonnet. I mean, largely contributed by geography teachers, of course, who were looking for somewhere sensible to put their stuff. So suddenly content is not king. My belief is it never was. Having stuff is nothing like enough. The Encyclopaedia Britannica used to be a career for somebody to sell door to door. Now there's a mass of stuff out there, including Wikipedia, which I'm not a fan of, by the way. I think the problem with Wikipedia is that they haven't got the communities right, so everybody can edit and alter everything, and then as a result you end up with quite a lot of nonsense. Encyclopaedia Britannica, meanwhile, is pulling its community of experts together. So when you want to go off and find out about the Hadron Collider, as I'm sure you all did the other day, you actually find people who really know their stuff in a community talking about what's going to be there, rather than a few random teenagers, saying that Hadron Collider would be a great name for a motorbike or whatever. The world's awash with stuff, and your ability to critique it, and of course, and make judgments about it. It all depends on your ability to contribute. If you can construct, then surely you're on the route to being able to deconstruct, and if you can deconstruct, you're on the route to being able to critique, and that ability to make and create and show and view and receive feedback from, and thus make judgments about, is very much where we are. But this is not a world where content is king, and the many companies that thought content was king, of course, have all gone to the wall and have all gone bankrupt, and now suddenly they've discovered that the internet is all about people sharing and communicating, as it always was from day one, and they now talk about Web 2.0 as though this was suddenly a revelation. I mean, it was a revelation to them. It was the bleeding obvious to the rest of us. So here we are, in a world where mutuality really matters, where knowledge is a free good, where sharing and exchanging with others, and that sense of other and that sense of us, turned out to be hugely important. And really no surprises there, are there, really? Because if you go back to prehistory, I mean, you look at cultures that have got a long tail of experience. You look at Maori culture, look at Aboriginal culture, look at Native Americans, all of whom at one time or another I've been involved with fascinating projects with. And what you find, of course, is that they've got really good signifiers of membership, really good signifiers of storytelling. They're not locked in a world of narrative linearity. They're not locked in a world of the ownership of knowledge. They're in a world of mutuality and exchange. And you start to realise that so much of what we've built economically on the world, copyright, for example, really doesn't sit very well in this future world. I remember being in a store in China with some good friends. I had some fascinating work in China, and I just find the country fascinating, young, full of good humour. It has issues. Gosh, who hasn't? And I was there with some good colleagues, and we were looking at books, and we realised that the books were largely pirated. They'd been replicated without permission, without the right payments being made. I had a right smile and asked the question to my good friend about all this, and he knew where I was coming from. I have objected publicly often enough about academic writing being given freely to journals, and the journals then wrapping it up in a cost model which allows them to sell the wisdom and understanding of academic journals to developing countries who can't afford them, and in a way, locking people out of the democracy of knowledge and understanding. So, he knew that I wasn't here to fight a corner for copyright, but his reply just fascinated me. He smiled, this lovely enigmatic smile, and he said, we invented paper about 3,000 years ago, and we don't get anything for the paper. So I'm not sure why the guys who did the ink should get anything either. It's a lovely humorous response, but it does carry, I think, that sense that we need to look back at how did we manage things in our earlier histories. How did we organise and signify community? How did we build memberships? How did we cope with people joining that we weren't quite sure who they were? That there's this great uncertainty of the internet about who is who. The elephant in the room of identity, which has been so badly handled. Turns out to matter, and a lot of early societies. It's definitely worth dust off your anthropology and start reading. And anthropology and social psychology, some fabulous revelations in how all this works. Which, if you're an interface designer, that should be your primary reading. Go straight to that. And Brenda Laurel, yes, but go straight to sociology too. So, what an interesting world we're in, and it's just interesting to reflect for a moment on the kind of mess we find ourselves in financially in the world at the moment. Because I think what's happened above all else with the economic meltdown, there's no better word for it, is what has happened in a number of places, and for sure, if we're not careful, will happen in learning, because technology has allowed us to do things that we haven't been able to keep up with in our understanding. A simple example being, if I go to the website wage slips for you, for the number, not the word, I find a website that allows me to generate proof of income, P60 forms in this country, whatever they're called in your country. And I can take those P60s along to a bank and say, here's my proof of earnings. I'm a primary school teacher, but I seem to be earning £250,000. And the banks never checked on those. It just they hadn't got their head around the fact that a certificate was only a piece of paper, and it didn't necessarily have that whole credibility of an audit trail of security behind it. And then they'd lend money on these things, and the banks, of course, thought they were being brave with lending 110% mortgages to people at 4 times their salary, but what they didn't realise was the people were talking up their salary to be 3 times their salary anyway. So 12 times their salary was the reality, and of course the banks didn't look very hard. They didn't care, because if property was going up, if whoever it was defaulted in a year's time, then the worst case, they'd inherit a property that was worth more money. Of course, it was only when the property prices started to fall that all started to fall apart. But it's the blind look of misunderstanding on everybody's faces in this crisis, that firstly they can't begin to see what's gone wrong. Well, technology has gone wrong. Technology has allowed people to outgun the banks in the end. But also it's the connectedness of all this. It's the fact that within a mouse click right around the world, decisions are made costs are bought and sold, and shares are bought and sold, and assets are traded and valued, and the immediacy of all that, with the clunky old system that we had. And people had been saying for ages that the banking system was way behind technology. Goodness knows it took them 3 days to clear a cheque. You put the money in electronically. Surely there was some immediacy there. And I think the systems had lagged so far behind technology. In the end, they were overwhelmed by it and continue to be overwhelmed by it. It's changed the world of learning in this way. I think what we've started to see as an impact of technology have been oligopolies disappearing. People that thought that 4 or 5 organisations had a handle on a market, would dominate the market, or even monopolise the market, their bluff has been called by everybody having the opportunity to be part of it and to make a difference. And I think we've seen oligopolies disappear in travel, for example, where now most of you watching this, if you want to book, I don't know, what are we coming up to Christmas, skiing if you're in the northern hemisphere, swim on the beach if you're in the southern hemisphere. We've seen people in that area start to say to themselves, I'm just going to look for a place that I like the look of online, and I'll book it up. I'll have a chat with the people who are renting it, book it up, then I'll find a cheap airfare. I will become my own travel agent. And that world where 4 or 5 travel agencies dominated our ability to be choosing where we went, just disappeared. We became our own travel agents, and those oligopolies disappeared. And you've seen the same disappearing for television, where suddenly everybody's a broadcaster of a radio, where how many internet radio stations and podcasts are there. For sure we'll see the same for schools. The thought that you might have a national curriculum dominating a country, it's already laughable. It's about as same as having a national airline. That it's doomed. And so I think what you've started to see with the new world that we're in is a move towards what economists would call perfect competition. Many suppliers, many buyers, and for sure in education, a multiplicity of people supplying learning of one form or another, and a multiplicity of people choosing to consume that learning. The number of children being home educated in the United States has doubled in the last 4 years, and over here in the UK, where we've got special circumstances because schools are trying to discourage people from attending if they're not going to pass their exams. So schools are criminally, I think, persuading people to take the option of being home educated when they patently, in many cases, haven't got a hope of any sort of education at all. So, here, the number of home educators is galloping forward as well. But, in the next decade, there will be so many options that school will just be one of them. School will be fighting for the attention of learners in a really interesting way, as indeed will universities too. It's only a matter of time before schools, in their attempt to stay in business, will get into that university space. I guarantee you within 10 years that schools will be offering undergraduate level work too. So it's a really interesting world that we're moving into. But I think what you learn most of all from the financial crisis is that it's the beginning of the death of they. That sense that they ought to do something about this. A banker taking a wild gamble and thinking vaguely in the back of their mind, I'm going to make good money out of this, but if it was really risky, they would have stopped it. That sense that there's a they out there that can do anything about this new world that we're in, I think has started to disappear pretty rapidly. And I think people are sitting there realising, gosh, it's us. It really is us. And for me, that the real change that this recession is bringing is the death of they and the beginning of us. And I think that's really, really important. And in education, how might we organise our learning? Suddenly you're seeing schools leaping forward in terms of the pedagogy that they're adopting, the organisation. We've got schools with, the front-running schools around the world with their project-based learning, their mixed-age classes, their 24/7 days, their democracy between teachers and children. They're closing their staff rooms because why would you have a special place for the old people in the school, when everybody's a learner? That democracy of learning, I think, is all about us, and the great new school designs that we're starting to see. I'll come to that in a moment. The great school designs we're starting to see stress that membership, that sense of community, that sense of usness above all else. Not just because it's nice, but because literally the future of learning depends on the strength of that mutual, collegiate, gregarious bond. Yeah, sure, leadership matters in the 21st century, but fellowship matters just as much, and that sense of a two-way conduit turns out to be hugely important. Now finally, where does this leave us? I think in a really exciting place. It leaves us in a place where there are three key characteristics, where learning is going global with a vengeance. So at schools in England, I was in Genogly College the other day, who were following the Queensland curriculum. They've shopped around the world and found something good going on in Australia. I thought, well, we'll have a bit of that, and that's what they've chosen to follow for part of their school curriculum. There are schools all around the world doing the International Baccalaureate with all its faults, and schools starting to swap and exchange pupils and projects and teachers, and partly because the levels of migration we're seeing are giving us some wonderfully global schools. I mean, working with a school in West London, it just feels like a prototype for a United Nations of learning. And what seemed to be a problem in the 70s and 80s, how will we cope with all these languages, now becomes, thank goodness we've got this opportunity of a global school prototype right here on our doorstep. So learning's going global. Secondly, all the assumptions we made about delivering learning, about those factory schools of lining children up, putting them in a room, in a box, the cells and bells model of learning is gone. It's gone out of the door, and should have gone out of the door with those dreadful factories that we built in the 1780s. The factory school is dead, and long live the learning institution that's emerging with its, I'm building schools all around the world, not a corridor to be seen in sight. Why no corridors? Because why would you spend 25% of the funding you've got on the space to move children around when they've got their heads down, they're so engaged they don't want to move? One of the biggest problems many of these exciting schools face is the poor old janitor at the end of the day trying to get children to go home because they're so engaged they don't want to leave. So, we're in a new era of schools, of agile schools, full of mutuality, able to be reconfigured and configured and reconfigured again at any opportunity. And finally, I think, socially, we seem to be rediscovering some of the things that really mattered. We lost the extended family through geographical locations of industry. People would have to leave their home to go and work somewhere else, and they lost touch with their mother and grandfather and uncles and aunts. My children, and for sure your children, are connecting up with their extended family, their cousins and their friends and their uncles and aunties and whoever, all around the world in a lovely sort of way, and they're chatting away on Facebook and they're a myriad other places. So suddenly some of the social indicators that made us so strong in terms of community are being reborn. We destroyed many of them with an economic model of productivity, which turned out to be completely duff. We built schools around productivity where we were chasing, a 2 or 3% gain year on year, and we missed the fact that schools built around mutuality and usness and sharing and democracy deliver extraordinary gains in learning, 100, 200%. The difference, the world we're in now, and the world we're in this side of the economic collapse is that there's no more calling the bluff. If we ignore the obvious, and the point I'm really making in this short talk is that we've known for long enough that all this was true. If we ignore the obvious, then the same collapse will face education that faced the financial system. People sitting around saying, well, you could see that one coming. It's not hard. You read the documentation from the UK's Ofsted, from the World Bank, from 1,000 other people who talk about a new model of learning. If we don't adopt it, then the old model of learning will disintegrate and will bite us in the face. For me, this is the most exciting time ever. This is absolutely the death of education. But it's wonderfully the dawn of learning. And the dawn of learning in a learning age that I believe is going to be millennium long is the most exciting prospect I've faced in my rather long but hugely enjoyable career. Thanks for listening, and I think there's going to be a chance to talk about this online later. Bye now.